Hi again, welcome back. This is our second recording in this series from week 8, where we are going to be talking about capitalism and authority. Capitalism is an economic system in which property and goods are primarily owned privately, investments are determined by private decisions, and prices, production, and the distribution of goods are determined primarily by competition in an unfettered marketplace. Prior to capitalism in England, the economic system was called feudalism. This included lords, vassals, serfs, and fiefs. The lord was the property owner of the land. The land was called the fief or the manor. The vassals were landholders, kind of like lessees granted use of land in exchange for military service and allegiance to the lord. Serfs were peasants who could farm the land, but who must give a portion of their production to the lord. They were bound to the land and forced to work for the lord. In order to understand our present economy today and its relationship to the social world, it's necessary to look back at least to the Industrial Revolution, which began in 18th century England as a result of the introduction of machines into the workplace. Prior to this time, people subsisted on their own for the most part, or as part of small economies. The economic process of the 10,000 years prior to the Industrial Revolution was based on the individual, especially concerning craftspeople. I'll come back to that slide in a minute. Craftspeople owned their own tools, worked in their own homes, grew or procured their own raw materials, and sold their own goods. As the population grew and the demand for goods increased, craftspeople looked to others as go-betweens to find their raw materials and to sell their finished products. Eventually, these intermediaries took over the process, telling the craftspeople what to produce and how much. The craftspeople became like employees of the intermediaries, and the intermediaries became what we know today as capitalists. So as long as the craftspeople worked in their own homes, this was called a cottage industry. So I want to describe this in this picture here. You can see this is a cottage industry. These are 3 generations of one family. You can see the mother is there spinning wool to make yarn. Prior to that, someone would have sheared the sheep, brought the wool in, then it would have been scoured, which is what the younger person is doing, over the fire, and then it would have been carded or kind of stretched by another member of the family. In this way, the people who owned the cottage industry, the family would have done all of the work on their own with raw materials that they owned as well. So they would have owned the sheep. They would have gone through this entire process owning the materials that they needed to create whatever product they were making. In this case, it would have been yarn. And then maybe even going a step further and creating something with that yarn, perhaps a rug, for instance. And the important thing for our purposes is that they would have owned the tools, they would have owned the raw materials, and they would have owned the finished product, the rugs, the yarn maybe, or the rugs. And before the intermediaries came along, they would have just traded or sold their goods within their own little village. Eventually, however, traders came along. We're calling them go-betweens or intermediaries here. And they would have had the ability to take the finished products to other villages and sell them there. And also they would have had the ability to get raw materials from other villages and then bring them back to this cottage industry for them to use. And this was great. It provided them, the people with the cottage industry, with the ability to make the most of their business. However, after a while, the intermediaries started to take over the process. They started to tell the people what they should make, what it should look like, and the intermediaries ended up owning the goods in the end because they would have supplied the raw materials and would have made money buying and selling these materials themselves. As industry began to centralize and the capitalists gained more and more control over the process, the cottage industry gave way to what was called the factory system. Oh, here's my slide about the intermediaries. Here's the factory system. Rather than moving between one craftsperson cottage and another, the capitalists began having them all work under one roof. They began to own the materials and tools needed to produce goods, and finally they owned the finished product. When machines entered the system in England around 1760, actually, I guess I put 1750 on your quiz. This is your second quiz question. It says, in the beginning of industrialization, when machines entered the system around 1750 in England, they profoundly changed the world economic structure. So it's the third option that you choose there. So, again, when machines entered the system in England around 1760, they profoundly changed the world economic structure and began the Industrial Revolution. Mass production became possible for the first time. Production itself was improved and saved time and produced more uniformity in finished products. Railroad and steamship systems were developed and enhanced the ability of the capitalists to sell their goods to a larger body of consumers. All this created tremendous wealth for a small few, the intermediaries that we've been talking about, who are now factory owners and who we now call capitalists. So there were many consequences of the Industrial Revolution. First of all, it changed the nature of work itself. First, fewer agricultural workers were needed because the machines did the work. These workers moved into the cities to work in factories, but eventually even these blue-collar workers weren't needed as much, and more white-collar jobs or managerial jobs were created. Also, it created demographic changes. As cities grew, because people moved into them to work in the factories, farms became fewer and the population increased on the whole. Once the society was industrialized, the population slowed down. Also, human relations changed. During and after industrialization, people have more interaction with a larger number of people. These interactions were generally more formal and more superficial and less intimate than what they had been used to in their small villages where they knew everybody. There were fewer primary groups, and ties to primary groups were not as strong. Some functions once served by the family were taken over by other institutions, such as the government. Also, values changed. Traditional values were thought of as old ways, and people became more comfortable with change. People started to hope for a better future. According to this, industrialization brought about a greater energy and open-mindedness, but also it brought about restlessness and discontent, maybe due to the pursuit of the material. Okay, so this ends our second recording. I'm going to go on to make our third one. Remember, this is in a set of 4.